I love Scott Pilgrim. Convincing myself to make this video is honestly one of the easiest things to do when the pros and cons list looks like this. All of its amazing characters, beautiful landscapes, and absurd rules and lore, God, it's so good! And I'm not just talking about one adaptation or even the original comic. I love every take on Scott and his tale to fight Ramona's 7 evil exes. The original comic stands so well on its own as this messy, convoluted tale of love, self-respect, and mental health. And the movie, aside from being my literal favorite movie ever, perfectly captures the awful actions of these characters and brings them into a really grounded, often depressing version of this story. Oh, and that's not even to mention the game adaptation, a perfect condensed version of Scott and Ramona's love that shows how beautiful it truly is, with the actions of wave after wave of enemies perfectly supplementing the 1,000 words of the original story. And don't even get me started on Scott Pilgrim Takes Off. Oh my goodness, a beautiful redux of the story we all know and love that highlights the way Scott Pilgrim and Ramona not only benefited the lives of those around them, but our lives as well. I could talk for hours on each of these adaptations, or even the original story, because I love them all, and they all have something unique to highlight about Scott's story. And now, we have Scott Pilgrim EX to add to that pantheon of amazing stories. Let me just reach in real quick and find exactly what it does different. I don't seem to see anything right now. We'll get back to that later. Let's talk about the game right now. It's the reason you're here, after all. Scott Pilgrim EX was announced in July of 2025 with a trailer at the Summer Games Fest showing that it was going to exist. People weren't exactly clamoring for Scott to return to the world of beat-em-ups. When Scott Pilgrim vs. the World the game originally came out in 2010, it stood out immediately for its use of pixel art and the return to the beat-em-up genre, helping bring both back into the mainstream. Not to say that either were entirely dead before Scott Pilgrim, but it, alongside games like Mega Man 9, 10, Double Dragon Neon, and the advent of digital shops, showed that there was merit to pixel art as a genre and that it wasn't a side effect of hardware limitations. However, it's 2026 now, a far, far, far different time than 2010. I should know, I was 5 in 2010. Pixel art and beat-em-ups are both far more common than they ever were before, so Scott had a little bit more to prove when it came to EX, and the reason why it had so much more to prove was in part done by its own creators. Tribute Games are the ones at the head of this project, showing that modern-day beat-em-ups are alive and well, with the back-to-back success of TMNT Shredder's Revenge and Marvel Cosmic Invasion. Both were extremely fun, classic arcade-like beat-em-ups that fans, both casual and hardcore, loved. So giving Scott Pilgrim that same treatment with the gameplay style that has already been proven to work for this character makes perfect sense, especially since Tribute Games was founded by ex-Ubisoft devs who worked on the original Scott Pilgrim game. Why not just do it again? What can go wrong, really? The story in EX follows in line with its inspirations and is rather simple. Scott one day wakes up and is followed by Metal Scott. He's like Scott, but made of metal. Metal Scott then kidnaps the members of Sex Bomb, leaving just Scott and Ramona to fight back. That is until Ramona calls on her evil exes, having Matthew Patel, Lucas Lee, Roxanne Richter, Robot01, and Gideon Graves join up to help them. I don't know why Todd wasn't included and was instead sent off to the shop and assist realm, but what are you gonna do? He's only the best out of the evil exes. Anyways, they go to fight Metal Scott, dealing with the 3 gangs that have formed around Canada: the vegans, the demons, and the robots. Also, time rifts keep opening up due to the power of time rifts, a series of notes that mess with time, and for some reason the band got mixed up in them, so you gotta deal with those as well. Eventually, you'll see that G-Corp, a company from the future, is behind most of this. More specifically, the children of G-Corp CEOs are the ones ruining everything in an attempt to find their father. Okay, really took a lot of inspiration from Sonic CD here, right? There are like 5 different plot points here that don't really tie into one another, and the plot doesn't matter that much in-game, which is honestly really disappointing, as it's a soft sequel to Scott Pilgrim Takes Off in the comics. I say soft sequel because the game follows a lot of the designs and character arcs of the show, with Super Ramona appearing, Knives being in Sex Bomb, and the exes helping, but still has characters like Lisa and Joseph show up for no real reason. But yeah, this is a sequel to Scott Pilgrim that in and of itself is incredible. In the decade plus since the final issue, there hasn't been a single attempt to ever follow up the story of Scott and Ramona. Yet, it never feels as though their story is being expanded in any way. The story is more wallpaper than book paper, which is rather disappointing, and sadly, the same can be said about the gameplay. The original Scott Pilgrim game, while not being anything special, is still a solid and enjoyable time. I replayed the game in anticipation of EX and enjoyed it a lot. The movement was fun, the characters were unique, and the progression system worked really well. EX takes a couple of cues from the original game, but remixes them in strange ways. While in the original game you would level up by defeating enemies, giving you new moves in the process, in EX you're given them all from the start, which is a changed, that's for sure. It removes the sense of progression and change you felt as you played the game, and this is important since Scott Pilgrim is a story about change and growth. Seeing Scott and Ramona's story of embracing change play out in front of you as their characters grew in their individual skills. Along with that, the characters feel a bit more homogenous now, with them all sharing the same styles of combos and moves. Everyone has the same light into heavy strings, the same up heavy, down heavy moves, and a projectile. These moves are very fun to pull off and can definitely lead to some interesting combos or just mindless fun, but the individuality of these characters is missing. There are no more cool, unique fighting styles really, not even any differences in the story. Sure, some of the dialogue is different, but the ending is the same. This means that now all you have to worry about are your stats, which you increase by buying food and items from shops. Just like the original game. Huh. Well, I mean, now you have two different equipment types, badges and accessories. Accessories are just basic stat increases, nothing really interesting, but badges are pretty cool, giving little modifiers to your moves or surroundings to give you cool possibilities in and out of combat. And the best change to the gameplay is in the assist, a total revamp of the ones from the original game. No longer do you just have one, now you can pick from a whole list of them, with references to characters, bands, and even moments from the original story. This is honestly a great change, not just for the references it gives you, but for how it helps the gameplay feel more active. Do you need a temporary invincibility bubble or an attack increase? There's an assist for you, and with how quickly you can change between them, trying them all out isn't that big of a hassle. But I saved the biggest change for last, as this change affects everything surrounding it. Now, remember the original game and its archaic, putrid levels? Ugh! And no. I don't mean the level designs, those were great. I mean the separation, the going from level 1 to 2 to 3 to ugh. Now, we have the more refined taste of modern games as Scott Pilgrim EX features a wonderful open world for you to explore. And, to quote myself here for a second, all you do is walk around. For a world as deep and as rich as Scott Pilgrim, this map is shockingly barren of anything of interest. Yes, there are some little secrets in the walls and cool little references to the original story in other games, but none of that makes up for the losses. Gone are stage transitions and the interesting locations that drew from the original story, destroying that feeling of exploring a world, not some preset locations. They somehow made an open world feel more limiting than literal levels. There is no benefit to this change, and it just creates more issues when it comes to backtracking and running around. The backtracking feels so pointless with you needing to run back and forth because the game needed to get a few more fights out of you, and that's all you're doing during these backtracks. Fights. There are no puzzles, no world building, or anything in between these moments. It's just fighting and running through the long track field the game gives you. But my goodness, is this a gorgeous track field. Yeah, while the level design may not be at its best here, at the very least they made it look prettier than The Last Supper. God, this pixel art is amazing. So fluid and bouncy in its animations, and each of these locations is filled with bright KOF tier backgrounds that are stunning. To quickly touch on the areas you find yourself fighting in, each of them features an ancestor of a Scott Pilgrim character that you fight because they have one of the Sex Bob members under their control. Lucas Lee's ancestor is a trained pirate, Envy's is a medieval gardener. They're visually stunning, but thematically they don't match the characters or the world at all. And because of how disconnected the themes feel from the world you're fighting through, it doesn't ever feel like you're in Scott Pilgrim's world. The original story features these everyday locations turned into absurd battle arenas where nothing makes sense but is so familiar. Places like Lee's Palace, Honest Ed's, the library, and the Chaos Theater, all locations that you can imagine parallels to, though never on the same level as the story. Areas in this game feel like either direct parodies of something or word and word combined for one-off gags. Nothing is as interesting as the original story or even the original game, which had you fighting through movie sets, trains, apartment buildings, and clubs. No longer are you fighting through Toronto, Canada, seeing the beautiful city and landscapes. You're playing through a generic fantasy realm. Nothing about these places are memorable. They just exist more as video game levels rather than actual places. And unfortunately, unmemorable is the best way to describe the soundtrack too. The original game's soundtrack is great, and that same group Anamanaguchi was brought back to compose this one, and unfortunately, the chiptunes just didn't hit as much as the original game's sound. Every song has this ch sound that makes them all feel the same, so most of them just faded away into the background. And this isn't helped by there being one song per screen. This should be a benefit as it means more music, which EX definitely has in comparison to the original, but that doesn't matter because of the backtracking. Because you're always running through these locations, I can tell you what the first 15 seconds of these songs sound like because that's all I heard. Huh. You know, with how many things are the exact same as the original game or changed for the worse or for no real benefit, it makes me wonder, why does this game exist really? Did Scott Pilgrim need a new beat-em-up? And with how much it borrows or ruins from the original game and story, just play or watch those instead. And I don't just ask this question because there's the original game to compare it to, but because of its story. What is this game's reason for existing? What is it adding to Scott Pilgrim that the other adaptations, or the original story for that matter, didn't touch? As I said in my intro, each version of Scott adds a different dimension to the story that the others don't have, and this one just falls flat on that front. The main villains are unique, but come from the future, and are connected to Gideon Graves, whom Scott and Ramona have already defeated, so why do they matter? It's revealed at the end that Metal Scott was just Lisa in disguise, hyping up a potential sequel despite this already being a sequel to Takes Off where Lisa was nowhere to be found, and even then, she isn't used to say anything new about Scott or her own character, and Lisa is really interesting. There should have been more time spent with these characters since it has been so long since we've seen them, but we get nothing. I would like to say that this game highlights how these characters have matured since the story of Scott Pilgrim, as Ramona is willing to ask for help and her exes are willing to assist, but that isn't really reflected in gameplay. When playing, neither Scott nor Ramona mentions that the exes are helping in any way, since they're never around, and when playing as the exes, the most you get is a few lines changed to know that they're helping. Even in multiplayer, the fact that the exes are actively helping isn't ever brought up. They're just there. Having the exes run around the barren landscape and help as either CPU characters or even just giving loot or something would have better highlighted the collaboration and maturity EX seemingly wants to think it's talking about. But the sequel often feels like more of a reset of these characters. Again, Scott Pilgrim is a story about change, so why are we fighting through time? Scott has already fought through his past and his future, and the story reuses characters like Simon Lee, completely ignoring why they were villains in the first place. He did nothing wrong! Scott saw him as an enemy despite him being a regular kid. This game wants to act as though it's something new, yet can't seem to separate itself from what came before it. EX is not its own thing with nothing attached to it. There's a whole collection of Scott Pilgrim works that it's following up on, and one that it shared direct DNA with. The original Scott Pilgrim game from 2010 was always going to be a tough act to follow. It came out at an incredibly important time in the 7th generation where small bite-sized downloads that you bought on the cheap were popping off, and this made for a unique approach to what was ostensibly a licensed game. The retro revival is what this era is often called in history, and EX fits into that time frame for no real benefit. It plays the same, it uses the same art medium, it sounds the same. Heck, even the people working on it made the original game in 2010, but none of it is unique anymore. These things were unique and different back in 2010 with the original game, to quote Jonathan Holmes' review for Destructoid. Quote, "The affection for pre-polygon days of gaming doesn't stop there. The game's graphics and sound feel like a match made in heaven. Both are overflowing with character and genuine love for their respective crafts, sprite-based gaming and chiptune music, and classic gaming in general." Unquote. At the time of the original game's release, these were forms of art that weren't seen as often and were worth discussing as defining traits. Scott Pilgrim as a story embraces retro gaming in many different ways, so the use of it in-game resonated with players of the time, connecting them to a style they saw as retro. The view of retro during the original game's release also helped highlight how Scott views his own world. He believes in final bosses, bonus levels, skill proficiencies, things that aren't really there but are to Scott. He believes in these things due to his connection to retro gaming, and they work because we connect them to retro gaming in the same way. In 2026 now, the view of retro has changed, and so EX isn't styled in the 8 to 16-bit Japanese scrolling beat-em-ups as Simon Parker puts in his original review for the game for Eurogamer. This is pixel art, and this is a beat-em-up, which have been around for years now. In 2006, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World the game art director and Scott Pilgrim EX animator Paul Robertson released a short film, Pirate Baby Cabana Battle Street Fight 2006. Styled after classic beat-em-ups, the short film follows a group of two men fighting against the titular pirate baby for a girl. The short film feels exactly of its era, with gross-out and absurdist humor and extreme violence. Also zombies. For the time, it was praised for those exact things, with many people appreciating the use of pixel art and the absurd humor. In fact, Brian Lee O'Malley enjoyed the short film so much that when he was told that Ubisoft hired Robertson for the game, he freaked out, calling him one of the talents of the project. As seen here in PlayStation Magazine number 41. The short film was not only impressive, but it was new, despite being old. Being a one-off project for Robertson, many people saw more to it, loving the project so much they wished it was an actual game, not merely styled after them. In an interview with Andrew Webster for The Verge, Robertson was asked if there was a chance to see the short film become a game someday. He responded, quote, "I'd say there's approximately 0% chance. I want to do something new, and zombies are way too played out anyways these days." Unquote. A constant rehash of what people remember leads to the erasure of creativity. Eventually, things change, and current trends like the retro revival fade away. The retro revival has happened, and we're living in the world post that, yet EX still acts like it's being put on the Xbox Live Arcade store to be bought with Microsoft points. We, as gamers, fans, critics, whatever, have changed. EX isn't retro, it's the standard. If Scott Pilgrim vs. the World the game was a breath of fresh air and a doorway into more pixel art in modern games, then Scott Pilgrim EX is just someone walking through that door in a costume. And that repetition could have worked if it had been used to say or do something new. Doing something new at Scott Pilgrim isn't just unique levels, bosses, and saying that it's a sequel. You have to make something out of what you've laid out. EX as a story has learned nothing from the multiple adaptations of Scott Pilgrim and highlights a rather negative aspect of Scott Pilgrim's story, the repetition of it all. No matter what happens, how many suns, sets, or moons pass by, the story of Scott Pilgrim is doomed to repeat. We are 2 decades removed from the original publishing of Scott Pilgrim, and we still find it relevant in our world. We still find ourselves suffering from the same issues societally that birth characters like Scott, and we still need to make space for them to learn. These characters don't age, and their arcs are reset whenever needed, so we can get a show, a game, a movie, and another game. Scott Pilgrim's legacy is repetition. Each of the adaptations, however, have embraced that repetition and used the change in medium to highlight a different aspect of its characters and its world, allowing them to stand out on their own despite being a retelling of the same story. There is merit to watching the movie or reading the comics, and neither is the same as watching the show, yet what makes EX stand out is that it doesn't stand out. It is more tied to what came before it than the actual adaptations. You might think I'm expecting far too much out of the story for EX, especially when the original game was just as, if not more, simple. And to that I say, yeah, but it worked. The simplicity of the original game made for a story that was far more unique than this one and showed the love of Scott and Ramona the best. Why does Scott love Ramona? Because he does, and to prove it, he will fight wave after wave of enemies just to get to her, all so that they can share a single kiss. It's simple, yes, but effective. EX isn't a story about Scott and Ramona, or even any of the evil X's. It's a story featuring Scott and Ramona. Scott Pilgrim EX is a fun game. Don't get me wrong, it's a solid beat-em-up with gorgeous art and features tons of characters and references for fans to point and smile at. I'd be lying through my teeth if I said I didn't enjoy seeing characters like Lisa, Lynette, and Wallace again, or even locations like the stairs Lucas grinded to death on, but references don't make a story. It's the equivalent of an art book, banking more on your attachment to the source material and your desire to see its characters and world. Everything within has been shown and done before, and anything new doesn't provide anything to the grander story of Scott and Ramona. I love Scott Pilgrim. While I was writing this, I pulled out my copies of the comics and began flipping through the pages, mainly as a reference guide, but I kept stopping at the moments that I remembered. The final moments at the Chaos Theater, Scott getting an assist from Crash and the boys during his fight with Envy and Todd, Scott's flashbacks to college, and Wallace making out with every guy imaginable. And I realized something. I already have the Scott Pilgrim story I wanted, and I've been able to read it, watch it, play it, binge it for years now. Why do I need EX? Why does Scott Pilgrim need EX? I don't think either does. I'd rather appreciate the story so many other people, and I, love. Look at me, using the L word again. Who am I kidding? I know darn well the second they announce anything relating to Scott, I'll be right there to watch a grown man date a high schooler again. You know, it honestly reminds me of someone. Oh yeah, it's like Castlevania. I mean, Sonic the Hedgehog.